Hello and welcome. We begin with the just concluded G7 summit in Canada, a high-stakes gathering held amid growing global uncertainty. While the world's most advanced economies deliberated on pressing global issues, leaders from the global south rallied together, calling for unity and equity. Leading the charge, the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi underscored the priorities of the global south during his interactions with world leaders at the G7 summit. Now, on the sidelines, Prime Minister Modi held talks with South African President Cyril Ramaphosa and with Brazilian President Lula da Silva. He described his conversations with both leaders as outstanding. Prime Minister Modi stressed that the leaders were unwavering in their commitment to issues that matter to the global south. He added they are determined to build a better tomorrow for future generations. President Ramaphosa has echoed that sentiment, saying the G7 must support the global south's efforts to build a fairer, more inclusive world order that drives sustainable development for all. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa was the only African head of state invited to the summit. South Africa is also the current chair of the G20 and will host the summit later this year. President Ramaphosa described the G7 gathering as successful, citing cooperation in areas such as investment, climate action, mineral security, and combating transnational crime.
Put on the table is the issue of climate change and how important it should be treated by the global community with regard to our just energy transition, and also what we intend to achieve out of the G20 with regard to climate change, the financing thereof. We also discussed the issue of critical minerals. We've discussed the importance of how our critical minerals should be treated, particularly in view of the fact that they play such an important role in energy security, and that the extraction of minerals from African countries and our.
Ahead of the G7, Ramaphosa held a bilateral meeting with Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. The discussions focused on wildfire management, technology, trade and investment.
A bit in the past, and I've been a longest admirer of your leadership of South Africa, and now your leadership of the G20.
Yes.
And the world is very much in your hands at a crucial time. And if I may say, from a Canadian perspective, the strength of the ties between our country are great, including down to the level of assistance in natural disasters. And
President Ramaphosa was also scheduled to meet U.S. President Donald Trump nearly a month after their heated exchange at the White House. But that meeting did not happen. President Trump left the summit early, citing important matters amid the ongoing Iran-Israel conflict. With President Trump's abrupt departure and G7 leaders failing to reach consensus on key global issues, it was the voices from the global south, like India's Prime Minister Modi and South Africa's President Ramaphosa, that stood out, emphasizing unity and a shared vision for a more equitable future. Now, for more on this, we have with us Musa Mdunge, an international affairs expert who is joining us live from Johannesburg, South Africa. Thank you for being with us, Musa.
Sorry, Alison, I can't hear you at all. But if I recall your question, you are asking about the Ramaphosa's involvement in the G7 as the lone African representative there. And I would argue, Alison, that it is largely to do with the fact that South Africa is currently the president of the G20. And that would necessitate, normally by the G7 president, this time the presidency being with Canada, that they would normally invite the leaders who are heading up certain key institutions in order to foster greater collaboration between the work that is done by the G7, which is the group of the most advanced economies, and other multilateral institutions. Of course, South Africa being the leader of the G20 this time around, the first time, in fact, that an African country is going to be the president of the G20 and host it, will get a chance to meet other leaders, both from the advanced economies, but other developing countries, such as the Indian Prime Minister, for example, which the president had a meeting with, in order to discuss issues around climate change, issues around global financing, issues around even debt relief for the global south, including middle income economies. And so South Africa has a key role in playing as the G20 president, but also has a key role as Africa's most advanced economy to advance Africa's interests. And it is a role that South Africa has played, I would argue, since 1994, but particularly took it of seriousness during the Mbeki presidency, where we even had then the IPSA group, the trilateral between India, Brazil, and South Africa. So I would argue, Alison, that South Africa is a key player.
Right. Musa, I hope you can hear me. Ramaphosa called on the G7 to support the Global South's efforts for a fair and inclusive global order. Now, in practical terms, what kind of support or policy shifts should we expect from the G7 in response to this call?
Certainly, Alison, President Ramaphosa raised very key issues here. And, part of the practical things, as you have asked, that can be done by the G7 in order to support both African countries, but countries of the global south, would be for us to see key reforms starting to take shape. For example, in the United Nations Security Council, South Africa, like India, has been calling for the longest time that the United Nations Security Council is not representative of the current global reality. We're no longer in a world where Western powers dominate geopolitics. There are other rising powers such as the BRICS economies. So a key practical initiative that can be undertaken, and I think, Alison, it would be key for countries like India and South Africa to push this, is to bring forth the proposals for how a reformed United Nations Security Council could look, and the remodeling even for the United Nations General Assembly. So that's key. Another key reform, Alison, would be for international financial institutions, for us to see reforms there. For example, the IMF and the World Bank would be key institutions where we would need to see reforms, not only in the voting rights afforded to the global south, but of course, in the changing the funding model from what some have argued from a loan-dependent model to one of a grant-dependent model that would reduce the debt burdens faced by the developing South. So I would argue that those are some of the initiatives, the practical initiatives that we can see the developing South, the global South, really push and agitate the G7 towards.
Right. And President Ramaphosa and Prime Minister Narendra Modi described their meeting as outstanding, and they committed to championing the global South issues. You've touched on a few there. Now, what does this growing South Africa-India alignment mean for the future cooperation within platforms like BRICS and the G20?
Alison, I would say that, this reignited bilateral relationship between these two key countries of the global South is a very, very important moment. In fact, I would argue, Alison, and I've argued in times past, it has been a missing element, I would argue, in global politics. We've had the voice of the global North as represented by the EU, by the G7, by NATO. We have the voice to an extent of the global South, but often it has been a voice muzzled between those of what some would argue as authoritarian regimes, such as in China and Russia, versus democracies like India, Brazil, and South Africa. And many have argued that these countries have been the missing voice in global issues for, I would argue, the past 10 years. The last time we saw these two countries be this engaged, I would argue, Alison, is during the Mbeki Singh days in the 2000s. And so it's great to see these countries come together. There's lots of things that they can work together on climate change. Both countries are faced with this challenge. Both countries have been pushed by the global north, for example, to make the jump towards a just energy transition, but that's not going to pay for itself. And so both countries can support each other, both in the advocacy of better financing in terms of climate initiatives, but also on issues of infrastructure, issues on security. South Africa and India, I believe, have a lot of work to do as so-called key non-aligned countries in terms of geopolitics. And in many ways, I think it is a good moment that we see these two countries come together.
Yes. Thank you, Musa, for being with us on Firstpost Africa. As always, great to have you on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Firstpost now available in 9 languages on YouTube. English,
$36 trillion.
French,
Le FMI, comme
German,
Geschäftsführenden Direktor,
Hindi,
$30 trillion kakarjo.
Indonesian,
Pemerintah tanpa pemeriksaan.
Italian,
Kali radikali.
Japanese,
4 兆ドル以上も
Portuguese,
por causa do próprio balanço patrimonial.
Spanish.
Beautiful bill.
Go to Settings, click on Audio Track and select the language of your choice. Be the first to know what's happening around you in your first language. Firstpost.